Hey AP Economics students, welcome back to a little video here I wanted to do on the difference between a growing economy versus an inflationary bubble. There is a real subtle difference here, but it's incredibly important in the outcomes, and I want to just do a quick little summary here to make sure that this is making sense. Both of these examples, both of these graphs here are identical. The economy is in long-run equilibrium, and what I want to demonstrate is what is the difference between the catalyst for growth. And so I'm going to, on this side here, I want to do the inflationary bubble, and I want to show you what happens, and it all depends on which one of these four components of the real GDP is the thing that's driving the aggregate demand curve. And depending on which one it's doing has very, very different effects. So on this side, what I want to focus on is what happens if consumption is increasing, or what if government spending is increasing. So over here, we are going to have an increase in consumption, or we could have an increase in government spending. Now, right away, what you should be thinking when you see those, you should say, well, I think that looks like something that would be driven by fiscal policy, which is true. And if these graphs were in a recession, that might be a way we would correct it, but I'm going to do this from equilibrium. So if consumption increases or government spending increases, we're going to have an increase in aggregate demand. But what we're going to do is contrast that with this graph over here. What happens when there's an increase in I? Okay, so never forget I, although it's called investment, is business spending. These two graphs are going to have very different outcomes. And this is a very important thing to make sure you keep straight. So for this particular example, we're not going to discuss net exports. That will be too confusing for this. So let's focus on this one right now. There's an increase in consumption or government spending. Well, that's a part of AD, and so I'm going to call our initial value here A. Well, we're going to have an increase in aggregate demand, which is not surprising, and we would just come over here and we'd say, well, there's AD prime. No big deal. And here is our new point of equilibrium, B. All right. Well, now let's go over here. There's an increase in I. Well, I is a part of aggregate demand, so there will be an increase in aggregate demand. And so we'll show that increase. And here is AD prime. And so again, this was point A, and we have increased to point B. All right. So the graphs look like they've had the same impact on both. But it's the next thing that happens that makes these fundamentally different. If you have just had an increase in consumption or government spending, so everybody's shopping and buying things and going to the mall or ordering off Amazon, everybody's buying a lot of stuff. Or the government is doing that very same thing. The government's going to the marketplace and purchasing a lot of things. Maybe it's defense spending, and they're buying a lot of vehicles and cars and jeeps and trucks and military equipment. But these guys are buying. That economic activity is good, and you can see in this case, the real GDP has increased. And we're on the hot side here of the ADAS model. And over here, if businesses are spending, and they're going to the goods market, and they're buying all sorts of things and expanding their businesses and building new buildings, buying new capacities to store material, and buying all sorts of equipment, expanding factories, new franchises. That's heating up the economy as well. But it's the next step that separates these two very, very dramatically. If it's just nothing but consumption going on in the goods market, that heats up the economy, can trigger a little bit of price level increase in inflation, and what's going to happen is, eventually, as price level increases and resource prices increase, all of a sudden it gets expensive to supply all of those things, and a triggering event of price level and inflation actually winds up having supply decrease, and SROS, short run aggregate supply, is going to decrease. And that's going to bring this back, and this we would call our SROS prime. And now here's our new place, C. And we have just gone through in a little inflationary bubble. Our price level rose, we came back, and we are back to full employment, because remember, this is, we'd always call this iron pot. We're back to our potential. We're back to full employment. And we just went through a little hot economy time. And sometimes this happens toward the end of every year, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, the Christmas shopping season, lots of consuming going on. And we get a little inflationary bubble. And at the end of this little cycle, you can see everything is more expensive, but we're back to normal, and we just had a little inflationary bubble, but it was the result of a hot economy. No big deal, and it's all good. All right? And then things slow down, and so maybe this happened in December, and after January, things are back to normal, and it's February, we'll say. And it's like, yeah, now everything's more expensive, and we're back, things are good, and all the little part-time jobs that happen in September, or in December, and late November, December, are gone, and we're back to normal. Okay? But now let's contrast that over here. If the thing that drove aggregate demand was investment, this is a very different situation. Because, yes, all of this activity may have triggered a little price level, but because businesses were expanding and they were building warehouses, new factories, new restaurants, new stores, building the capacity to supply more things. So, for example, if a business built multiple more locations, a restaurant expanded to 2 or 3 more franchise or restaurant locations in an area, company that manufactures built a few more factories, we now have the capacity to supply more. All of this activity was to enable the businesses to supply more things. So our short-run aggregate supply doesn't shrink because of this activity, it expands. And so now our aggregate supply, our ability to make more things, has increased. And here's S Ross prime, and here is our new C value. Because it was investment that was driving it, not just the malls just weren't busy and Amazon wasn't busy, it was businesses spending so they could increase their capacity to make more things. Well, when this happens, this new point is very different, and what winds up happening is now we have an increase in our long-run aggregate supply. And what we have is economic growth. So this now is L Ross prime. So these are very different things. Your economy just got bigger. This one was an inflationary bubble. Well, these are two radically different things. And so, for example, this one, if we were to draw the production possibilities curve on this side, this is an example of when you have an economy and it actually grew. And remember, this is called the PPC, production possibilities. Our production possibilities are now bigger. This is represented on the PPC by economic growth. We have a bigger capacity here. Whereas over here, the PPC that never grew, it was just kind of hot. And in fact, if you remember, I said when you first learned about the PPC, technically speaking, there's a little bit here that you could get in a hot economy. We always say that beyond this is unattainable. Well, that's true, except for really close here. You can get some points inside there because this is full employment and this would be a really hot economy, just that little gray zone. So this would be point B just as in here, and then it cools back off and comes down. This one, point B, was here, but then it resulted in point C. Now we have an even bigger economy. We have economic growth versus an inflationary bubble. Super important you keep those two straight. Well, now to add to this, this is why there is such a difference between the fiscal policy and monetary policy. The politicians are in charge of these two things. You can increase consumption or government spending with fiscal policy. And so that's why most economists are always, they're not real pleased typically with fiscal policy, because fiscal policy tends to just be kind of a temporary thing. Well, fiscal policy, you can directly affect government spending, or you can have a tax policy that's going to impact consumption. So these two things, government spending and consumption, are directly related to fiscal policy. However, over here, this is monetary policy. The reason monetary policy affects this is monetary policy is all about one thing, and it's interest rates. That's all they care about. What is happening to interest rates? Now, the monetary policy is controlled by the economists, controlled by the people that understand entrepreneurship and investment, and they want to always create an environment that allows the investment to do, the businesses investment to do what they do, which is always to create wealth, create jobs, grow the economy. So they're highly, highly interested in having a low interest rate because they know that's going to lead to an increase in investment. And that's going to lead to economic growth. And this is going to be a permanent change in your economy. It is just plain bigger. That's what they're interested in. Whereas fiscal policy just has temporary changes. Now, normally, fiscal policy can be very effective if I would have drawn two graphs in a recession. And this fiscal policy can be very helpful to get out of a recession and to just get you back to normal. But I wanted to show this change here coming from equilibrium. And monetary policy can do that as well. Both can affect recessions, but sometimes fiscal policy can very quickly fix recessionary gaps. But those are the two main things. So how do you change government spending and tax policy? This is all politics and Congress and the president campaigning for a certain spending program, stimulus package, or tax policy. So this is all very politically driven. And over here, this is controlled by a country's central bank. In the United States, it's called our Federal Reserve. So the Fed is in charge of all this using their three tools. So here's the two tools for fiscal. For monetary policy, it's all about interest rates, but you know that there's three ways to affect interest rates. You could affect it with the reserve ratio, the discount rate, or open market operations. It's all about that. Now, the one thing also that I want to stress here is the two phrases that AP especially likes here is that whenever monetary policy lowers interest rates, there's always an increase in what they call interest-sensitive spending. So whenever there is a decrease in interest rates, that's always going to lead to an increase in, I'm going to use this phrase, interest-sensitive spending. They love that phrase. Now, interest-sensitive spending does include consumption, because people will buy more cars, so there'll be an increase in C, in consumption, but the one that's really important is the increase in I. So even though there's secondary increases with consumption spending, it's the investment one that's so big because it's businesses that lead to a growing economy. It's not consumers that lead to a big growing economy. That just makes a hot economy. But this is hot, which led to growth. This is hot, which led to inflation, which led us back to normal. Very different. And so low interest rates leads to an increase in interest-sensitive spending, which is an increase in investment, and you can say an increase in consumption. Those are both interest-sensitive. Okay, but the big one is here, which is, I'm going to make the next line here, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, with our shorthand. So increase in investment and consumption, an increase in aggregate demand, and that increase in aggregate demand, if you wanted to be really picky, you could say, which leads to an increase in price level, which it does, briefly. But it also leads to an increase in, here's our next super important phrase. I'll put an increase in. Well, we have the increase there. When you see the phrase capital formation is what businesses build. They build capital. So they build buildings, they get equipment, they've created capital formation, and that capital formation leads to an increase in SROS, which leads to, capital formation and SROS are interchangeable here, and this leads to an increase in real GDP, which leads to an increase in long-run aggregate supply. Now, not every single step along the way here has to happen. Sometimes you can just jump to interest-sensitive spending an increase in investment, you could even just jump right from there to an increase in capital formation and an increase in real GDP. Or you could just go from leading to investment, capital formation, to an increase in LROS. But all of these things are true, but it depends on the question about which ones you want to emphasize. So super important to get this. Low interest rates, what do? They lead to an increase in interest-sensitive spending, which is consumption, but that's a temporary change. The biggie is I. Interest-sensitive spending, which is investment. And what happens when they do that? Well, that increases aggregate demand and price level, but it leads to an increase in capital formation. That's the huge one. And that capital formation is what leads to the increase in SROS versus the decrease in SROS. Okay? So over here, when the price level goes up, that leads to a decrease in SROS because there's no capital formation. It's just a hot economy. So I'm going to write this one over here. When we have an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxes, that leads to an increase in consumption. Okay, so either one of those two. Actually, I'm going to put those vertically so we don't have confusion here. So we have an increase in government spending, so for fiscal, or I have a decrease in taxes that leads to an increase in consumption. Whichever one of those you go to fiscally, what that's going to lead to is an increase in aggregate demand, perks up the economy, and that leads to an increase in price level. But there was no capital formation, and that increase in price level eventually is going to lead to a decrease in SROS because price level is too high and inflation has been triggered. So it's really important that you guys get this little difference right here. Yeah, they both drove up the price level to B, but this was capital formation versus this was just hot economy. Okay, let do a decrease in SROS, we're back to normal. Okay, super important difference you want to make, and it also ties in the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Okay, so I hope your preparations are going well as you hit the final preps here for AP Macro. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time.